Hello, everyone. Today's lecture is on management for security incidents, and we will begin with a good overview of security plans. What are the things you need to include in a security plan, and how do you create one? In particular, we're focusing on continuity in the case of a actual security incident, and then outlining response steps, things that you would need to do after an incident to address some of the ongoing concerns. We'll outline some of the steps and best practices for risk analysis, because this is one of the key things that you have to identify in continuity planning, is to identify what are the main things that you should be preparing for. And then we'll talk a little bit about natural and human-caused disasters and how to address those, how to respond to those. So a security plan is going to consist of all of the boldface elements here. Policy, meaning essentially the goals that you have for your security effort and all of the things that people will have to do to achieve those goals. That's the policy. The current state, this is essentially the status of security or information security at the time of the plan. And this is more important than it might seem, simply because if you don't know where you are, it's very hard to figure out how to get where you want to go. Requirements, so identifying and specifying security requirements, which are the path toward achieving your high-level security goals. Recommended controls, the kinds of things that we're expecting to be used to achieve the security requirements, to implement the security requirements. In particular, we want to map all of these controls to the specific vulnerabilities that were identified in the policy that we're trying to address. Accountability, this is more important than it might sound like, simply because if you don't know who's responsible for each of these security activities, it's very difficult to make sure that they're actually addressed. A timetable, essentially figuring out when and how to achieve security functions. And then finally, a maintenance plan, some ongoing structure for periodically reviewing and updating both the security plan and also the requirements that implement the security plan. All right, so what is a security policy? Well, essentially, a security policy is a high-level statement of purpose and intent that answers three essential questions. First, who should be allowed access to whatever information it is that you have? To what system and organizational resources should they be allowed to access? So the kinds of things that they need for their job, that sort of thing. And then three, what are the types of access that each user is going to need for each of these resources? Worth noting that most security policies have both an internal statement for employees at the organization and an external statement for other stakeholders. This is certainly true with privacy policies. So a privacy policy is the internal, typically the internal discussion that you would have, and then a privacy notice is the notice that you would provide to stakeholders on the outside of your organization that they would need to know about the policy you have on the inside. Now, the terms are kind of used interchangeably when people are talking about privacy policies, but the concept is essentially the same. You want to have an internal policy that describes in more detail than the external policy what you're actually hoping to achieve and what you're hoping to do. Partly because if you have an external policy that is super detailed, no one is going to read it. And that is already the case for privacy policies. Very, very few people actually read these sorts of things. But the organizations that do read them are very interested in holding people accountable, holding organizations accountable for their public statements with respect to security and privacy. That's essentially the main way that the Federal Trade Commission operates in the United States, and it's very similar in European countries as well. Okay, but the security policy in general, the internal policy, should actually have an explicit statement of all of the security goals that the organization has. A good example of this is whether or not a reliable service is higher priority than some other security goal, like preventing infiltration. Another specification that you want is some identification of who is responsible, right? The group or the individual or the user who's responsible for ensuring this goal doesn't get compromised in some way. And then finally, a specific statement of commitment, meaning what sort of ongoing review and maintenance procedures do you have? Where does this actually fit within the larger corporate structure? And so on, right? Very important to have in a security policy. Once you have both a plan and then a policy, you need to be able to assess the current status, right? What is the current state of the organization with respect to information security? This is primarily done through risk analysis, and that is actually something that we will be covering in quite a bit of detail, because after you are assessing the current status and you implement part of your plan, you need to continually reassess the status to figure out if you're getting anywhere close to your goals, right? So risk analysis and these sorts of security assessments will be going on continuously or periodically throughout an organization's life cycle as they reassess compliance with their plan, compliance with the policy that they outlined. And this is important for a variety of reasons. Some of the stuff is actually going to have to be released to external organizations depending upon the domain that you're operating in. So, for example, if you're under an audit rule for the Federal Trade Commission, you may actually have to provide evidence that you've done a security assessment. And that's true for a lot of large organizations. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all of them have been under audit requirements for the Federal Trade Commission for a long time. Mostly as a result of previous failures, but these audits are very important in terms of regulatory compliance. Okay, so how do we actually identify what are the risks? Well, this is a really critical question we'll be talking about in some detail. The main idea behind a security assessment, though, is the identification of what are the risks and defining it in enough specificity so that you would then be able to go off and measure all of these sorts of things. So we want to define and limit responsibility for assets, figuring out who is actually responsible for the assets, for protecting the assets, who is not responsible for protecting assets, which is almost as important, and then figuring out the boundaries of responsibility for shared assets, who is responsible in the situation that an asset is handed off, meaning you've got one piece of your information that is, or piece of your organization that is currently the purview of one group, but will eventually become the purview of some other group. You can imagine this being a product that is in development being the responsibility of the development team, but once it is deployed, then it would be the responsibility of the ongoing maintenance team. All right, so I think we'll move on to security requirements in the next segment.